From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, friends, and patrons, and welcome to the African Middle East Division. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all in our reading room. As most of you already know, our division is made up of three sections: the African, the Near Eastern, and the Hebraic sections. We're responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Saharan. Our Hebraic and Judaica collections come from all over the world. We also serve these materials to patrons here in our reading room and organize programs and exhibits. We have a great Persian exhibit, by the way, across the Great Hall, and I invite you all to go and see it. We also hold programs, like today's programs, that inform our patrons about the countries and the cultures that our books come from. The librarians in this division are themselves scholars and published writers who have written about those cultures. But we like to invite scholars from outside, very often our own patrons, to come and talk about the countries that they write about, that they work on. And today we have a fascinating program on the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. As you know, the Ethiopian Church is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world and is an intrinsic part of Ethiopian history, culture, and society. The subject of today's talk is therefore of critical importance for any student, scholar, or layman interested in understanding Ethiopia. And to do so, we have Dr. Ephraim Isaac, an eminent scholar in the field of Ethiopic studies, who has published widely in the field, and more recently has written a book on the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Fentahun Tirune, the Ethiopian and Eritrean specialist in the Hebraic section of this division, and the person to go to when you want to know anything about Ethiopia or about our collections on Ethiopia, has organized this program and will be introducing the speaker. But before I sit down, I would like to recognize Prince Hermes Sahli Selassie, who was a speaker in September 2011 and made a wonderful presentation on the Lion of Judah. We have a small publication that has been widely circulated. I also want to recognize Dr. Peggy Perstein, the former head of the Hebraic section, who has come specially to attend this program and who is with us today. She's sitting at the back, but she is here, so I wanted to recognize them. And now to introduce the speaker, our own Fentahun Tirune. Thank you.
Okay, Excellency, members of the clergy, and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this event today. As you know, we have a very special guest speaker today, Dr. Ephraim Isaac, as we call him in Ethiopia, who will be discussing on the Ethiopian Tewahedo Church based on his latest book. But before I introduce our guest today, I would like to mention that this event is videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's webcast and other media. There will be a formal question and answer period after the lecture, in which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. Please also limit your questions strictly to the topic of today's discussion. Unfortunately, this forum does not entertain questions that are political. We thank you for your understanding. Dr. Ephraim Isaac was born in Ethiopia, where he got his early education, and he holds a BA degree in philosophy, music, and chemistry from Concordia College, a Master of Divinity from the Harvard Divinity School, a PhD in Near Eastern Languages from Harvard University, a Doctor of Humane Letters honorary degree from John Jay City University of New York, an honorary Doctor of Letters from Addis Ababa University. From 1968 to 1977, he was the founder and first professor of African and Afro-American Studies Department at Harvard that endowed the Ephraim Isaac Prize for Excellence in African Studies in 1998. In addition to Harvard, where he was voted the best teacher each year by the students and department, Dr. Isaac has lectured on ancient Semitic languages at Hebrew University, lectured courses on African American, Near Eastern Studies, and religion at Princeton University, taught religion and Semitic languages at the University of Pennsylvania and Howard University Divinity School, taught religion at Lehigh University, and at Bard College, taught religion and history. Additionally, the subjects he taught include Biblical Hebrew, Rabbinic literature, Ethiopian church history, religions in Africa, concept and history of slavery, and ancient African civilizations. He has been a fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute for the Advanced Studies. Dr. Isaac is author of numerous articles and books on late Second Temple Jewish and classical Ethiopic or Ge'ez literatures. Three of his works pertain to the oldest known manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, published by Doubleday in 1983, and an Ethiopic history of Joseph, published by Sheffield Press in 1990, and Proceedings of Second International Congress of Yemenite Jewish Studies, ISS, and University of Haifa in 1999. His recent book, The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, published by the Africa World Press in 2012, is very popular. He is currently working on a new edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments of the Book of Enoch and a cultural history of Ethiopian Jews. He is on editorial boards of international scholarly journals on Afro-Asiatic languages and Second Temple Jewish literature, respectively. Dr. Isaac, the international chair of the Horn of Africa Board of Peace and Development Center in Addis Ababa and USA, and chair of Ethiopian Elders, director and Institute of Semitic Studies in Princeton, New Jersey, fellow of the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation since 1998, fellow of Butler College in Princeton University since 1995, has received many honors, including King of Sweden decoration as Knight of the Order of the Polar Star, the Morton Dosh Conflict Resolution Award, the 2002 Peacemaker Award of the Rabbi Tenenbaum Center for the Interreligious Understanding, and others. Dr. Isaac has diverse accomplishments. He knows 17 languages. He is the first translator of Handel's Messiah into Amharic. He is widely known in Ethiopia as founder of the National Literacy Campaign of Ethiopia that made millions literate in the late 60s and early 70s. He is emeritus president of the Yemenite Jewish Federation of America. He is on the boards of the many other charitable and educational organizations. Sought after nationally and internationally, he is widely acclaimed as a public lecturer on religion, literature, ancient history, peace and conflict resolution, and various other subjects. Above all else, I personally cherish his simplicity, his passion for peace, and his big, loving heart for humanity. Please welcome Dr. Ephraim Isaac.
So you heard the lecture. Any questions? Kibrota Fantahon, I thank you profoundly for inviting me to speak at the Library of Congress today on the subject of my new book, The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. I also want to express my deep appreciation to your colleague, the director of the library, and Ms. Perlstein, whom I met years ago when I came to catalog the Ethiopian manuscripts that are found in this library, and also honorable friend and all of you whose names some I know, some I don't. But in any case, I'm really very, very pleased and very honored to speak to you today on this particular subject. Let me start by just quoting a few places from this particular book and then make a few summaries. I think I don't like eyeglasses when I read. I would like to read a paragraph from my introduction, which says, "Some might ask why a Jewish person should write a book about the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. From my first year at Harvard University, when I became the first Ethiopian student of the famous Divinity School, studying comparative religions, I began to realize that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is the most Jewish of all Christian churches. But I also continue to say in this regard, anyone interested in Judaism can naturally be interested in the subject, as well as in the whole history of Christianity." And then I'll read a second quotation. "The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has roots in the early Church of Jerusalem and contributed much to the preservation of Judeo-Christian literature." Then I'd like to give another quotation from the book. "The Jewish molding of Ethiopian Christianity, specifically its effects on praxis and teachings, has been subject of great ecumenical curiosity, at least since the time of Abu Salih in the 13th century." One more passage. Just by trying to show the dimensions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's not just a local church. It has become an internationally recognized church. Here I refer to its connection with the African world. "Ethiopia has long been a symbol of redemption for Africans and Afro-Americans. The Ethiopian church evermore became their spiritual homeland." So I just would like to touch upon those three subjects: the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in its international, ecumenical, historical context, and the Ethiopian Church in its relation with other religions, particularly Judaism. And thirdly, just to touch upon the importance of the Ethiopian Church, not for just Ethiopians, but the whole African world. In the context of the history of Christianity, as you already heard, Ethiopia is second to none. Just as an example, today the Bible has been translated in almost 2,000 languages. One of the first 7 languages into which the Bible was translated was the Ge'ez language. Any scholar who studies the Bible and who would like to know something about biblical criticism must know a little bit the Ge'ez language, because Ge'ez, along with Greek, Latin, of course Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, is one of the first 7 languages into which the Bible was translated, and many different biblical versions have been preserved in that language, and scholars must be able to understand this text. And you can see in my book the picture of a gospel. It's called an illustrated gospel from Abba Garima, one of the churches of the first saints, gospel, the earliest known illuminated gospel in the world. According to some British and French scholars, I'm not a scholar in the field of art history, it's probably the oldest illuminated gospel. In my field, however, I can stand here and tell you that what makes the Ethiopian church very, very important, its preservation of many lost ancient Christian literature and Jewish literature. Among these, of course, are the two books, the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. As you heard, I made a new translation of the book Enoch in 1983, which was published by Princeton Seminary, by the Doubleday Press, in the collection of the Princeton Seminary, the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. I am presently actually working on two other manuscripts of this particular book. About in 1998, I think, during the conference of the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I participated in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Jerusalem. And one night, while we were all sitting out in the desert in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, there was a reception. It was a beautiful night. I went around like a devil's advocate and asked many of the scholars, I said, okay, we're also proud about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What really is significant and new among the literature that have been discovered in the Qumran? Of course, everybody recognized there were books like the Manual of Discipline, which we didn't know about, the War Scroll, which we didn't know about, but almost everybody unanimously said to me, to discover fragments of the Book of Enoch is one of the most significant discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was so proud to hear that. Why? Maybe many of you know. Because the Book of Enoch, incomplete, is preserved only in the Ge'ez language, in the Ethiopic language. This is not a very light matter, because most scholars today believe that in order to understand the evolution of Judaism 2,000 years ago, and in fact, the rise of Christianity, one single book outside of the Bible that one must know is the Book of Enoch. The book is actually quoted at least in one place in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament, but it also, however, ideas in it about the Son of Man, about the coming new world and so on, which are extensively described in the Book of Enoch, are quoted in the Gospel of Matthew. Concept about the resurrection of the dead. People say, do Jews believe in the resurrection of the dead? Yes, they do. And they, in fact, in the Amida prayer, the morning prayer, Tefillah we call it, the second prayer is about the resurrection of the dead. It's not mentioned in the Bible. Where is it mentioned? In the Book of Enoch. Years ago when I was teaching at Harvard, I had an Islamic scholar from Persia visiting Harvard. And he calls me one day and he says, I know you'll be working on the Book of Enoch. I want to know more about it. Because he said a lot of Islamic ideas are also rooted in the Book of Enoch. So the Book of Enoch is really so important, so central. It has been translated in numerous languages, by the way. And in most universities in Europe, in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway, in Japan, everywhere, people are reading the Book of Enoch. And I'm glad my own translation is being read by people who understand. Therefore, the context in which the Ethiopian church appears to the world today is in that context of its centrality in the preservation of important Judeo-Christian literature. I'm not here standing on one foot summarizing the history of the Ethiopian church, but I'll touch upon a couple of ideas. Number one, there are basically two theories about its origin. Some say the Ethiopian Orthodox Church goes to the conversion of baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch by Philip, one of the apostles of Jesus. It's described in the 8th chapter of the book of Acts. And this is actually the position of the official Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Among those friends of mine who are members of the Orthodox Church, you can speak about that more than I can. But yet scholars believe that the conversion of Ethiopia to Christianity begins with the reference in the book of Rufinus, a historian of the 5th century, who talks about Frumentius and Edesius, two men who were shipwrecked, and Frumentius became a tutor for the future King Ezana, and then was later sent to Egypt and came back as Kasata Brahan Abuna Salama and became the first Ethiopian bishop. Actually, there is a good deal of truth to say that the roots of the Ethiopian church does go to the 1st century. Even more than what the Ethiopian Orthodox teachers say, that it goes to the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch, even before that, there is a reference to Ethiopians in Jerusalem. Who knows about that reference? Well, actually, Gregory, Archbishop Afewerki in Amharic, Chrysostom, talks about on the day of the Pentecost, I think that's described in the 2nd chapter of Acts, there is a description of people speaking in different languages, and among them, the people who are described are Ethiopians. So maybe, if there were Ethiopians who were already being converted to Christianity on that day of Pentecost, that's even before the Ethiopian eunuch. But more interestingly, however, numerous other early church fathers have also referred to Christianity in Ethiopia. Maybe, as the scholars and historians say, it became the official Christian church in the 4th or 5th century, in the time of Emperor Ezana. But the fact that there were many people who converted to Christianity in the 1st century, we have many evidences. What is interesting is some of these people were actually probably Jewish. According to one Ethiopian tradition, it says before Christianity, half of the people were Christian, half of the people were Jewish. And many of the people who were going, like even the Ethiopian eunuch, he was traveling to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. And the people Chrysostom refers to also were pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, were probably worshiping in the temple. They may have had some Jewish roots, but they became Christians. So essentially then, the connection of the Ethiopian church to early Christianity is very important and very significant, a field in which we can do more research. Having said that, standing on one foot, all I can tell you is, if any Christian church in the world today can show that it has connection to the earliest Christian church before Paul, the church of Peter and James, what we call the Jerusalem church, only the Ethiopian church can do that. Which brings me to the second point. Now, I can say much more about this, but forgive me. Which brings me to the second point. The place of Judaic, Hebraic thought practices in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This might be, on the one hand, connected to the view that half of the people were already Jewish, but it might also be connected to the fact that the earliest Christian in Ethiopia, the ones who also played a very important role in the translation of the Bible from possibly the Septuagint and the others, and the people who really came from Ethiopia to Israel, to Jerusalem for pilgrimage and returned, had injected a very strong Jewish leaven in Ethiopian culture. Many of us, I have written, actually it goes back to the 19th century when Noldike, the great Semitist, said, if there is Jewish cultural influence in Ethiopia, one word alone would prove it. And he used the word mitzvah, mitzvot, mitzvot. Mitzvot in the Hebrew Bible means just commandments, God's commandments. But in later Judaic thinking, it means almsgiving, mitzvot. But in any case, there are numerous other Hebraic, Jewish Aramaic. Forgive me if I don't describe all of these things. You can ask me what Jewish Aramaic means. Numerous Jewish Aramaic like Ta'ot, Tabot, Mitzvot, and Makdas, and so on, which are found in Giz literature, which again shows this connection of the Ethiopian church to early Judaism. And there is another very interesting dimension to this. In early Islam, we also found some of these words as loan words even in the Quran and other literature. And scholars believe that the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad also were exposed to Ethiopian Christians who already were using Jewish Aramaic. Well, just one word alone, Al-Mamar, the place where the leader of a religious official works. In Hebrew too, it's called Al-Mamar. Member. The root of it is in verbal form is only found in Ge'ez, not in other Semitic languages. Of course, Ge'ez is a Semitic language, as you all know, but certain words found in Ethiopian literature are purely loan words from Semitic. So Al-Member, for instance, and Ta'ut and others, they believe that there's Jeffries, I think, who has written about this, the Ethiopic words in Islamic tradition. So in any case, there are numerous other examples I can give in terms of maybe some of you have read my article, is the Ark of Covenant in Ethiopia, that particular tradition about the Ark of the Covenant, the practice of eating certain types of foods are regarded as clean and unclean foods and so on. So the Ethiopian church has this very connection to the very earliest Jewish Christian church of Jerusalem. Now, I want to give you more time to ask me. So the first point I tried to make is then that the Ethiopian church in context, is in ecumenical, historical context, it is not only an Ethiopian church, but it is an international church that is very central in world church history. The second point I'm making, it is a particularly unique church whose practices and cultures are connected to Judaism. The third point I make, maybe this is a footnote, if you want to call it a footnote, is in context of what I said about the role of the Ethiopian church in the ecumenical and international context, the important ideological place it had in African American and Afro-American and African traditions. This, by the way, is a very interesting field, and the reason why I want to touch upon it is because I think we are sitting here at the Library of Congress, and we have to know that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a role in the struggle for freedom of African Americans. A year ago, I was invited to Savannah, Georgia, to see the oldest African American church. It's called the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And they later became African American Church. Indeed, one story is that before some kind of early emancipation, African Americans were not supposed to have a church or congregate. They feared that they might cause a rebellion, and therefore they used to go to other Christian churches and sit at the back. But the first church in 1799 was actually named the Ethiopian Baptist Church. And I understand there is a very benevolent white farmer who kind of let his workers have their own church. And this early church, it was called the Ethiopian Baptist Church, evolved into the African Baptist Church. And now the oldest standing building from 1850 in Savannah, Georgia, is called the African Baptist Church, but its roots were that Ethiopian Orthodox. And from this arises a terminology which we call today Ethiopianism. So the concept of the existence of a free black African church in Ethiopia was very central in the thinking of African American intellectual leaders. William Wesley Brown refers to it. He even, by the way, now there are some of my good white scholars who would like not to connect it to Ethiopia, and so there's one person who has written, well, when they say Ethiopia, they're referring to the Ethiopia in the Bible, where, for instance, African-American ministers used Kusha atu yadaham al Elohim in Hebrew. Ethiopia shall raise her arms into the Lord. And that was a theme of a lot of African-American preachers. So some people have said, well, they were thinking about the Ethiopia in the Bible. We can disprove that theory just by pointing to the fact that the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which, by the way, in New York now is one of the biggest churches, goes back to 1807. So it's not just the Ethiopia mentioned in the Bible that was of great significance in the thinking of the African-American people, but also the very Ethiopia that we're talking about, this Ethiopian church, that it played a very, very important role in inspiring the fight against slavery and fight for equality and so on. I remember when I first came here, by the way, before some of you were born, I came to the States around 1958. I was really amazed how many of the few, I was in the Midwest for 2 years and I didn't meet many African Americans, but later when I came to Boston, Harvard, I met African Americans. In those days, they, of course, even before a few years before the civil rights movement, many people used to come to me of African American background saying, oh, can you tell us about Ethiopia? And then I was told about a group called Rasta who worshipped Emperor Haile Selassie. And they lived in Jamaica, apparently. So my first vacation after being appointed at Harvard in 1970, I took a trip to Jamaica. And in those days, the Rastas were feared in Jamaica. They were really feared. So I was sitting on the plane. I was sitting next to a middle class, maybe upper middle class Jamaican lady, and she was very happy to see that I'm from Ethiopia. And then at the end, when I said, where can I find the Rastas? I want to see the Rastas. When we got out of the plane, she ran away from me. And when I was in the hotel, I said, I want to go and meet the Rastas. My hotel said, no, we're not going to be responsible. We're not going to send you there. So I said, call a taxi for me. No, we won't call a taxi for you. Because they're murderers, they're thieves, and so on. So I went and stood on the street, and I tried to haul a taxi. They were all passing me. Whenever I said, do you know where I can go and meet the Rasta people? And then, finally, one Rasta stopped and said, oh, you know Mortimer Plano? And I said, who is Mortimer Plano? He said, Mortimer Plano is the head of this Rasta group. Do you want to go there? He said, are you sure? Yes, I said, yes. Well, you see, I was told by the hotel they will kill me. But when I got there and I was dressed like this, they started singing songs. And Mortimer Plano sent messages, and all of a sudden, something like about 70, 80 people started singing songs, and of course, smoking marijuana, and they offered it to me, and I said, I've never smoked cigarette. And they said, no, this is not a cigarette, this is a sacrament. I said, I don't even smoke a cigarette. He said, oh, he's from Ethiopia. He has the spirit in him already. He has no need like us. They told me that when His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie came to visit, and of course they would not let him come out of the plane because they said God has come. And then all of a sudden, by the way, do you know the story that it was very rainy, and when the plane landed, it became sunny? You know that story, don't you? And they told me, we went to the emperor and asked him, you're God, aren't you? And he said, no, I am not God. And we knew he was God, because God is humble. So I established this wonderful, and then they started singing songs, and their dedication to the Ethiopian idea, whether it is directly with the church or with Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has a big international dimension. More than that, many of you know, recently the great leader of South Africa, Mandela, passed away. I don't know how many of you know that in South Africa, and my colleague at Harvard, Mr. Chirenge, has written a book about particularly the Ethiopian Zionist churches of South Africa and Zimbabwe. Even Mandela belonged to that at the beginning. I was recently saying, you know, how amazing how the world remembers Mandela and not Emperor Haile Selassie in the same context, a man who also fought against colonialism and who became a symbol for the Rastas and the others. But it's just something very significant in terms of, let's forget one person or another, the role Ethiopia played in the mind, in the vision, in the beliefs, in the convictions, of Africans and African Americans. The first missionaries from America who went to South Africa and others went as missionaries of Ethiopianism. The various independent churches of Africa, the Kimbangwist movement, the Aladura movement in Nigeria, the Kimbangwist in the Congo, and the African Zionist Church, Ethiopian Zionist Church, they were all inspired by the spirit of the Ethiopian church. Maybe I should, actually, you see, I'm a professor, which means I cannot stop if I start talking. So I better really interrupt myself and just maybe conclude what I'm trying to say. So what I've tried to tell you is, number one, that Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in its ecumenical context, is part of the international Christian tradition, and plays a very central role in the early Christian history by preserving literature, by even preserving many of the practices and the customs. The second point I try to make is it's a significantly, specifically, an interesting church connected to Judaism and plays a very important role. The third point I tried to make, again, this point may not be related, but for me, they are very significant because I cannot talk about, is the role it then in modern times played, willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously, because many Ethiopians don't even know what Ethiopia meant in the mind of African Americans and Africans. And so its role and in everything has been so significant. I'll conclude by saying, when I started writing this book, I said, I started wanting to write a book called Religions of Ethiopia, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But it just turned out that each one is a big book. I'm now working on my second volume called Judaism, and then the third one will be Islam, eventually in the context of the religions of Ethiopia. But I am very pleased that this book is completed, and I hope that you will all enjoy, learn something from it. And there is, by the way, one final point I'll make is that anybody, as I say in my introduction, who talks about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church must also understand the Eritrean Orthodox Church is identical church. In fact, the only person, a bishop, who read this book before it was published is an Eritrean bishop. So I would like very much to say, I thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll conclude by, again, this statement: Ethiopia shall raise her arms unto the Lord. And many of you are Ethiopians here, you can play a very important role by doing what? Know thyself, as the Greeks said. Read about Ethiopia. You don't have to read this book. Read about its culture. It's a fascinating culture. It's a culture that's so important to our people in Ethiopia, to African people. And so it is not only about Ethiopia, this particular book, it's about the international, ecumenical, African-American, African world. And thank you very much for listening to me. There may be some questions.
I'm very familiar with the monophysite concept, but in page 32, you talk about the reforms that Zariah introduced, and you talk about the Miaphysite Christianity. What's the difference of the Miaphysites with the monophysites?
The question is about Miaphysites and monophysites. Yeah. There are numerous issues about Ethiopian church theology, which I discuss in this book. And the end of this book, by the way, is a collaborative effort that I have an analysis of Moshe Ruli's book on Literatura de Ethiopia, Ethiopic literature. Regarding the Ethiopian Orthodox Church belief in monophysites. Now, if you talk to many Ethiopian Orthodox people, they'll say we are not monophysites. How many of you know what the debate was in the early church? In the early church, there was a theory about, was Jesus both divine and human? And the Council of Nicaea, the Council of, they all affirmed that. Then in about 459, there was a fellow called Eutychus who came up with the idea of his divinity was absorbed, no, his humanity was absorbed into divinity, so he's just one, so monophysite. While Eutychus got condemned as a heretic, the bishop of that time, Dioscorus, actually, well, some people condemned him. In the even Ethiopian church, Eutychus is a heretic, the father of monophysites, but Dioscorus isn't. And the reason why, like the Miaphysites, they are both really, mono means only in Greek, okay, monos. Mia means one, okay, one nature, or only one nature. But my own understanding, talking with many Ethiopian theologians, I think the Ethiopian church also believes in the idea of Jesus is both human and divine. Some of you who are Ethiopian church priests might criticize me in what I'm saying. So it is a mistake to call the Ethiopian church. Even I used to think when I a monophysite. Now, the other churches that are called monophysites are, of course, the Armenian Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Indian Malabar Church, the Coptic Church. By the way, beware, don't call the Ethiopian Church Coptic. This is a very important point I must make. Coptic is literally a word means Egyptian. How do you spell Coptic? C-O-P-T. How do you spell Egypt? E-G-P-T. You see, Coptic, Gyptic, it's the same word. It's the Greek word. And in Latin it became Coptic. But it has created a tremendous problem for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In Jerusalem, where the Ethiopian Church has, by the way, in my lecture I was going to mention this, that already in the 5th century, Jeronym, the translator of the Vulgate, makes a point. He says, multitudines quotidiae acceptus de Ethiopia, the India, and so on. We see multitudes of people coming to Jerusalem from Ethiopia, India, and others daily, which means that the Ethiopian church has its roots. By the way, it's a very, very significant church in Jerusalem. There are many numerous churches. And I'm mentioning this because the Ethiopian and Coptic churches are side by side. How many of you know about the struggle and the fight between the two? A bishop has been killed during Easter time, maybe about 15, 16 years ago. Because the Egyptians claim that the church of the two angels is theirs. Even today, you will be surprised, in New York Times, or the Ethiopian Coptic Church. It's a contradiction. I mean, Ethiopian Egyptian church. There isn't such a church in the world. It's either the Ethiopian church of Ethiopia or the Egyptic or Coptic church of Egypt. So the Copts are also, however, related to the Ethiopians within the Eastern Orthodox as the monophysite churches. But this is a theological question which we could debate. I used myself to think that, but if you read much Ethiopian theological literature, I don't think they accept Eutychus is even condemned, the father of monotheism. Sorry.
Do you think that it's true that the history of King Solomon and Queen Sheba's possessions, and which goes back to King King Menelik I, Solomon's son, that who brought probably also a lot of Jews, Hebrews into Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. You know, the borderline between truth and legend is very thin. It's almost like mixing water and oil. They are separate, but sometimes they kind of interact. I used to believe, like everybody else, you say legend, and it's all false. Truth, it's all true. Sometimes truth itself is not quite true. Read the newspapers. Almost 25% of what's written as truth is false. And much of the truth that is left out. I think there's a grain of truth in the story of the Queen of Sheba. All I can say that. we learn that not only from the story of the book of Kings, the 10th chapter, but also from our information regarding travels and trade in the Dead Sea, in the Red Sea. A very famous classicist, Professor, what's his name again? I'm trying to remember his name. He used to be a colleague of mine at Harvard, and he's now at the Bowersack, has written a little book about the Adulis inscription. Just came out last year. He's never even been to Ethiopia. And in his research, of course, he makes one sentence about how there is a strong Jewish, he said, you know, all this documentation shows a strong Jewish presence in Ethiopia 2,000 years ago. So whether you can relate the Queen of Sheba, by the way, I once wrote a little letter to the Wall Street Journal, which they, by the way, gave a very favorable title, and they called the Solomonic decision. What I tried to point out is that the South Arabians say, no, the Queen of Sheba came from South Arabia, from Yemen. Ethiopians say from Ethiopia. And I tried to say there was a time when South Arabia was never a single state. There were 4 city-states. But Ethiopia was a state already established maybe before Christian period. So, and it ruled or controlled a good deal of South Arabia. So the issue is not whether she came from Ethiopia or there, but there is a possibility. There are mentions of queens in other places who ruled in this part of the world. And whether she is located in Yemen or Ethiopia, it doesn't matter. But I think there is a grain of truth that something like this existed. As you know, in Islamic tradition too, there is a very extensive description of Bilqis. And in Jewish tradition, Targum Sheni, there is a whole book about the Queen of Sheba. But the most complete description of her history is in the Book of Kings. And where that comes from, again, I have to take a long time. That's the whole description by itself, because why is the Book of Kings so important, and why is it the most extensive history of the Queen of Sheba? Having said so, I appreciate your question. This may not be exactly the question of the Jewish presence in Ethiopia. The Jewish presence in Ethiopia, I think most scholars today accept it, particularly in the north. Now, here's something we have to distinguish. There was a time in the 19th century when most scholars like Conte Rossini, and even maybe going back to Rudolphus in the 16th century, believed that the founders of the Ethiopian civilization came from South Arabia, Semitic-speaking people who established. I think this theory can no longer hold water. More and more scholars have come to believe that while Jews came to Ethiopia, and maybe some people of Arabic origin came also and mixed with the people of Ethiopia, the original people really were like the Cushitic people. The Cushitic people are like the Oromo, the Somali, the Beja, and these people accepted Christianity. Why did they use the Giz language? The Giz language is not the language of any one particular group. It's an ancient language which also related to the ancient Semitic languages. And now we believe that the Semitic languages themselves may have originated in the Horn of Africa. So the question of the issue of the Queen of Sheba, whether it's a legend, a truth, as I said, there may be a grain of truth in it, but standing on one foot, I'm not going to say it's true or false. But on the other hand, the presence of a large number of Jews in northern Ethiopia at one time, who mixed with the Cushitic people, and gave rise to what we call the Ethiopian civilization, is more or less something that can be demonstrated through research in our history.
Everything we do on every aspect of life, and even education, starting with the Ethiopian the Christian schooling system, up to the higher education, and Islam also. So I don't know if you have discussed that in your book.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, there is a chapter called Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in Ethiopia. But as I pointed out, I am writing a 3-volume book called Religions of Ethiopia. This is about Christianity. The next one on Judaism is almost finished. And the third one will be on Islam. And apropos your question, in fact, today I belong to the board of several interfaith organizations called Tannenbaum Center for Interfaith Organization, Temple of Understanding, Fellowship in Prayer, where Jews, Christians, Muslims. In fact, 3 days ago, I was at Iftar, Ramadan Iftar at the United Nations, where there were Jews, Muslims, Christians. And they're all trying to talk about coming together, creating a fellowship. Ethiopia is the most exemplary country in the world for religious tolerance. Not only tolerance, some people don't like tolerance, for religious interaction. When I was working, I'm still working as an elder in Ethiopia, I had a colleague, Futurari Amade Lemma. And it's amazing, he's written a couple of books and he's a great man. He describes in his book how Muslims used to raise money to build churches. And Christians would raise money to build churches. In other words, in Ethiopia, this idea of religious coexistence it's part of the culture. And now, I'm glad you asked me that question, and I'll conclude by telling you there was, in fact, in the 15th century, a humanist called Damião de Goes. I sometimes refer to it maybe in this book. He was a student of Erasmus. How many of you know Erasmus, one of the founders of the Renaissance? Damião de Goes was a Portuguese who came across some Ethiopian Christians from Jerusalem. And he did some research and study, and he wrote this book called Fides Religio Moresque Ethiopium. How many of you know Latin? Fide, the faith, religio, the religion, Moresque, culture of Ethiopia. And guess what the book is about? He says, well, here in Europe, we're killing each other. Even Christians are killing Christians. We're fighting with Muslims, Christians. There is a country called Ethiopia where Christians, Muslims, and Jews live in peace. Why can't we not live in peace like Ethiopians? It's a very interesting book. The book was written in Latin, and because the Catholic Church objected to it, it was put on the index. How many of you know what the index means? Prohibited books. Now, of course, the index has been abolished. Some 2 centuries ago, Johnson, the one who wrote Rasselas, translated it into English, actually. I'd like to see that book translated into Amharic. If any of you, no, I don't have time to do everything, but if any of you have the time, find the book by Damião de Goes. And it's interesting that 400 years ago, today, in Europe, in America, they're talking about interfaith coexistence, but they still don't coexist. They still fight with each other. But in Ethiopia, in fact, whenever I go to some place, I don't know who is a Muslim and who is a Christian. I mean, they intermarry, they live together, and they respect each other. And as I said, the last example I'll give you. The last acting patriarch of Ethiopia, the acting patriarch, Abuna Nathanael, no? Abuna Nathanael was the Archbishop of Wallo. No, not Wallo, the Eastern Ethiopia, Arusi. And about maybe 10 years ago, he came to see me. He was trying to build a church in Zwei area, I think. I don't remember now. No, it's somewhere in that area. He's a wonderful archbishop, by the way. He's archbishop, but he was acting patriarch for a while. And he says to me, he came to me actually to help him to fundraise for the church. And I said, how come the local people? He said, yeah, but the local people who've given us money are only the Muslims. I was very touched that the Abuna Nathanael was building a church, and the majority of the people who contributed to the building of the church were the local Muslims. So that has been. Now, things may be changing a little bit in Ethiopia today because of world history. But Ethiopia is one of the most, when you talk about interfaith organizations, I'm on the Tannenbaum board, I'm on the Temple of Understanding board, I'm on the Fellowship board, I don't know, 4 or 5 of them. And they all talk about how can we create interfaith understanding. Go learn from the Ethiopians.
I think with that note, we end it here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.